Hello, my name is Christopher Renstrom, and I'm your weekly horoscope columnist here on Astrology Hub. And before we get into this week's horoscope, I wanted to tell you a little something that's going on with Astrology Hub. Here at Astrology Hub, we are celebrating over 3 million downloads of the Astrology Hub podcast, and we'd love to include you in the celebration. Enter for a chance to win one of 3 prizes by submitting a review of the podcast via iTunes, Spotify, or other major podcast players. Now, what we want to know from you is, what is your favorite thing about the podcast? How has it helped you to improve your life? And did it do anything to enhance your understanding of astrology? You'll receive bonus points if you're an Inner Circle member and mention your Inner Circle experience to us. Now, this is what you could win. The top prize is a free mastery class from the Academy. The second place prize is 1 free month of the Inner Circle. And the third place prize is 1 free astrological report. Now, while Facebook and YouTube comments are appreciated, we want to ask you to please submit your review via your podcast app to be considered. Please be sure to leave your name so we can find you in our system. Well, with over 3 million downloads that have taken place, I would imagine there are a lot of names in the system. Okay, so that's the little thing that I wanted to share with you this week. Now let's get into the astrology of this week. The astrology of this week is a little bit heavy. I mean, I have to confess, I'm not a big fan of Mars-Uranus squares in general. They tend to be very volatile, and they tend to be very dramatic in the way that they exercise their energy. It's really kind of like this thunderstorm that takes place over the horoscopes, affected whenever Mars and Uranus square in the sky. But looking at this week's horoscope, and looking at these week's planets and their planetary dispositions, I was really sort of moved to ask, I think, some questions that are appropriate to the Mars-Uranus square. And the questions that I want you to think about as we talk a little bit this week is, when is a good fight right? When is a good fight good? These are the things that I want you to think about as we talk about the Uranus-Mars square this week. Nobody likes conflict. A lot of people don't like conflict. Even people who work in areas of conflict don't like conflict. You know, nobody really likes conflict. Nobody really likes anger. Nobody really wants to be combative. But there are times in your life in which conflict and anger and being combative show up, and they have to be dealt with. Now, a lot of us might want to tune it out or sidestep it or say, I don't have a dog in this fight, you know, and that might be the case. And certainly if you can avoid a conflict, that's a good thing. But one of the things about being an astrologer is that you have to honor the energies of the planets involved and their configurations. We have to honor them for 2 reasons. The first one's pretty obvious. The planetary configurations take place, so you have to honor them. Everyone on this planet has to honor them because that's what's taking place upstairs in the sky, okay? So you have to honor life. You have to honor the way that life is taking place. Sometimes life is really, really wonderful and good and peaceful and benevolent, and sometimes life isn't, and you have to honor that. You can't sweep it under the carpet or pretend it doesn't exist or, go do something else until it's past. I mean, you can in some situations, but there are going to be situations in your life in which you really cannot. Okay. And so that energy has come into your life in some sort of way. So as an astrologer, we have to honor the planets and their courses and the way that they behave, because there's no stopping them. But then also our job as astrologers is to interpret. Our job as astrologers is to interpret what's going on with the planetary energy and try to advise and try to guide. So when we're looking at something like a Mars Uranus square, you have on one hand, the Mars energy, which is Mars is named after the Roman god of war. So Mars is combative. Mars can get warlike, and Mars can go on the attack. All right. A square, which is an aspect in astrology, a square, the nature of a square, the characteristic of a square is Mars, by the way. Trines are ruled by Jupiter, sextiles have the characteristic of Venus, and squares have the characteristic of Mars. So one of the planets involved this week is Mars. And so we have Mars in Aquarius. And Mars in Aquarius will be squaring Uranus and Taurus on March 22nd. Uranus is a much slower moving planet. It takes seven years to go through a sign. And so, it sort of sets the tone or flavor of its transit. And then it's going to take 7 years to play out. And what's interesting is that on the day that Uranus entered Taurus on 2018, Mars was in Aquarius and Mars was squaring Uranus in Taurus on that day. I think it's like around May 10th or something like that of 2018. So what you have here, a lot of people predicted, Uranus and Taurus is, destruction of the economy and ruination of markets and the end of capitalism and all these sorts of things. Everyone likes to get so apocalyptic when we have these things that are going on in the stars. But anyway, so this is what's going to happen, and economies will be ruined and all these sorts of things. And I don't know, Uranus isn't out of Taurus yet, so it might happen. But usually what you see with a slower moving planet, and by slower moving planet, I mean the modern planets. That's any planet discovered after 1781. Actually, the first modern planet was Uranus, and then comes Neptune, and then comes Pluto. So modern planets is the word that we use for those planets that were discovered after 1781. And Uranus, in its role as the revolutionary planet of astrology, the planet that comes in and kicks over the game board and sends all the pieces flying, Uranus was actually discovered. It's the first of the modern planets. It was discovered in 1781, right at the midpoint between the American War for Independence and the French Revolution. So Uranus has this very volatile, revolutionary energy to it. And so Uranus is going to change the rules of the way that the game was played before via whatever zodiac sign it happens to be traveling through. And so, you think of Taurus, and Taurus is absolutely a sign that's connected to money and to property, because Taurus is pretty much connected to land, and it's connected to turf. The symbol of Taurus is bull. It's cattle. And what do cattle do? But they graze and they cover land and territory and earth. And so with Uranus here, you've got this upset in the territory and in the turf. And what I've been noticing since 2018 is actually Uranus has been doing this extraordinary redistricting campaign upstairs in the sky. And we've seen redistricting going on in states here in the United States of America. We've seen redistricting going on in countries. And we've seen redistricting going on in nations. It's kind of like a reworking of where the demographic or where the people are going to be gathering. And it's kind of reworking of this that's going on. And it's been an area of concern for people who are on all sides of the political spectrum. When you add Mars to the equation, and Mars is in the zodiac sign of Aquarius, Aquarius is very future-oriented. And Aquarius is very future-oriented, and it's very principle-oriented. It's very what is the working system that all of mankind is going to live under? A word that comes up with Aquarius a lot is the collective, the concerns of the collective and things like that. And it is the concerns of society. I'm not a big fan of concern of collective because it sort of sounds like the Borg ship in Star Trek. But anyway, it's concerns of society on a whole. And so what you can have with Mars in Aquarius is that it can get very ideological. another word for it is political, but I'm going to go with the word ideological. It's going to be, this is the ideology. This is how I'm convinced that everyone should live, or this is the game plan. It's not like how I am convinced. This is the game plan about how everyone should live, and this is now going to be imposed on society, and everyone's going to live like this. Okay. So there's a lot of shoulds with Aquarian energy. There's a lot of doctrine and didacticism and a lot of absolutes. I mean, Aquarius is a fixed sign, remember, of the zodiac. So there's a lot of absolutes. This is absolutely the best way to live. This is absolutely, how a society should be run. Okay. So when you get this is absolutely the best, the way that everyone should live. And then you get a sort of redistricting or a reshuffling of people, sort of fit that idea. You can have people who are signing on board and saying, that's a great idea. We should all live like that. And then you can get people who are like, no, that's a horrible idea. That's dreadful. We should not live like that. Okay. There it is, the history of our civilization in a nutshell. It's always a coin toss. You flip and for a while it's heads, and you flip and for a while it's tails. Okay, so there's always going to be some sort of controversy or disagreement. And a way that a lot of disagreements ideally are settled is through our rules and laws, which also translate into our day-to-day life as etiquette, protocol, and etiquette. And these, as you probably have already recognized from previous podcasts, refers to Venusian energy, which is what is the proper way of referring to someone, what's the proper way to conduct yourself around someone. They sound a little, effete or delicate, but actually etiquette and protocol has been responsible for fights not breaking out or taking over things. It's even sports, with all of the, with all the focus and fury and competition, you still have the referees, you still have the judges. There's still a proper way to conduct this sport or to play this sport. When there's a foul, fouls are called. This all falls within rules and laws and etiquette and protocol. And it could even be said the reason that sports get so competitive is because they have to honor reason sports get so competitive and so exciting, okay, is because they have to honor this protocol and they have to honor these rules and these laws. And so it really is, showing off the person who is exceptional in their athleticism. It's not just brute force, but it's like playing the sport. And so things like strategies and game plans and things like that show up. So we have this idea of a Mars in Aquarius squaring a Uranus in Taurus, and it's very volatile. And so what can also happen when you have a Mars in Aquarius is that fights and combats can be justified. Okay, fights and combats are justified on principle. Fights and combats are justified on an ideology. Fights and combats are justified in the name of doing the best good for the most people involved. We're going to engage in this combat because, all of society will be served by this, and this is what's going to happen. So for all of the gloves that can be put on, and with Mars and Aquarius, and all the talk of like principles and ideologies, and we're doing this for the best of everyone, it's still Mars. It's still a fight. And all fights in this regard can be dirty. All right. And this is something that we're seeing play out on our television screens with what is going on in the Ukraine, and also the high risks that are involved. What's going to escalate it, what's going to bring it to an end, diplomats scurrying around and trying to bring some kind of an end to it. And so it brings us back to the question, when is a good fight right? When is a good fight good? Okay. And so what that gets into is, we're fighting for a way of life. We're fighting for a civilization. We're fighting against an oppressive regime, So these things, come to the fore, and they're very much coming to the fore right now. And because we're dealing with a lot of decisions right now that are dealing with the future of the planet and our civilization. We're not at a crossroads. We're at a threshold, and it's really about taking that step over the threshold. Is it going to be an elegant entrance, or is it going to be a pratfall? We are in the midst of finding out. But I want to tell a really silly story. It's a quaint story. It's a story that, I don't know, I think it might make a number of you laugh, but it's an important story to me. And it's a story from my childhood. It's actually something that took place when I was in the 5th grade. I can never remember what ages we are in the 5th grade. Was it like 9 or 10 or 11? Somewhere around there, preteen. So this is something that took place in the 5th grade. And I come from a large family, all boys, and we're all born 1 year apart. And so we were kind of like known as the Catholic quintuplets. Okay, so anyway, so my experience of rough and tumble was pretty well versed. I was used to being beaten up upon and beating up on others, and things like that. I was 4 out of the lineup of 5, so I spent a lot of time getting beaten up on. But anyway, it's guys. This is what guys do. Okay, so there's all of this, and at school, on a regular basis, like I was in the 5th grade, and my 5th grade teacher, I love my 5th grade teacher. My 5th grade teacher's name was Mrs. Stone, and she had like dark black hair with a little bit of gray, and she was always very crisp and well put together, and she had a sort of soft voice, but there was a strength to it. It was really kind of like a radio voice, and she was glamorous. I mean, she was just like a very beautiful woman, and very articulate, and really prompted and encouraged my love of learning, especially in book reading and history and things like that. I mean, I was one of those types. Okay, I'll confess to it. It was like, I always asked for extra homework because I wanted to impress Mrs. Stone. It's like, I wanted to get that A, and I wanted Mrs. Stone to be pleased with how I enjoyed her recommending books for me to read and history lessons and things like this. So this is, this is my headspace in the 5th grade, impressing the teacher. And it wasn't to show off or anything like that. It was just, I loved history so much, and I loved reading books so much. And she always had, a well thought book or history plan or something like that to share. I always learned something from her. And, I got aggravation, of course, from the other kids. They're like teacher's pet, things that kids do in their infinite gentility and sensitivity. Childhood. But anyway, but there was this one jerk. There was this one like jerk. I mean, there's no other word for it, and he was in a different class, but he would always sort of like find me on the playground somewhere and say like, you're a fag, like that, like you're a fag or a faggot, and of course I had no idea what he was talking about at first. So, okay, this is childhood 5th grade. This is, pre, and I went up and looked it up and, was aghast, like it means homosexual. Well, actually I had to ask my mom first and she explained it. That I was like, it means homosexual. But I also read like it was a bundle of sticks and a cigarette, in Britain or something like that. So I thought I was really quite clever and really quite smart when this kid showed up the next day and he was like, you're a fag, I was like, I am not a bundle of sticks, or like the next day he would be like, you're a faggot. And I'd be like, I'm not what they call a British cigarette. I mean, honestly, how gay can you get? Anyway, I thought I was being Oscar Wilde in my wit. But anyway, this went on and on and on, and he kept increasing it, and kids started pointing and laughing and all these sorts of things. So it finally got to the point where he had said this on the playground or something like this, and I had it. So I slugged him. really hard. I mean, I was just like, I had it. And so, he looked kind of like astonished and amazed or whatever. And he, threw, a punch. I mean, of course, when you're in the fifth grade, you're imagining this punch fight like Marvel superheroes or something, but I'm sure it looks much more like Alexis and Crystal, like pounding purses on each other from Dynasty. But anyway, in the moment, in the fifth grade moment, it's like we're throwing punches and things like that. And basically, I beat the crap out of him. I mean, basically, that's what it came to. Okay, and I, and so, I was, and the kids had gathered around, and they're like, "There's a fight, all these things, and it's hallucinatory, and you're hitting and things like that." But anyway, he was the one who was on the ground, and I wasn't, and I was ready for more, but I stopped. I stopped because I looked up past all of these, jeering children who are like, hit him, kick him, whatever, like children, they're just so lovely. But anyway, but I saw Mrs. Stone. She had walked up to obviously where this commotion was. And she looked at me with her steely blue eyes, and I lost it. I began weeping like a baby. And she said, "Well, you know where you need to go." And I was like, and so I walked off to the principal's office, and kids were like, good fighting or something like that. I was so full of shame. That's really what I sort of wanted to communicate. I mean, I had fought, what, in my eyes, actually at the time was a good fight. This kid was giving me a hard time and calling me, names, and you stand up for yourself. You punch him back. That's what. And so I was at the principal's. Oh my God, I just like wept. Oh my God, you would have thought that, I was like a biblical heroine or something. The way I was like lamenting and carrying on or something like that. In the principal's office, and they had to like console and calm me down and things like that. I don't know, I got detention or something like that. But I just remembered that for like a week, I could not look Mrs. Stone in the eye, because I was just full of so much shame. And then eventually, she passed me a new homework assignment. I think it was the Gold Rush or something like that. We're back on speaking terms, after a proper probationary period. But the reason that I'm sharing with you this story is that, if you look at it the reason that I'm sharing with you this story is that I felt justified to, hit back or to hit this kid who was tormenting me. He's calling me a fag every day and being really dreadful. And nowadays that probably would get a lot of support. It would be like, but what I felt on the other side of what should have been a good fight, what I felt on the other side of, when is a good fight right? When is a good fight good? Was an incredible amount of shame. It was an incredible amount of shame. And it wasn't shame of like being gay or anything like that. I mean, I grew up in Northern California. It was like not a big deal. No, the incredible amount of shame was in having thrown a punch, in having hit someone, and having hurt someone. And I did, in all of my, feeling horrible, think about going back and apologizing to him. And then I just remembered, well, he's such a jerk. So I didn't. So, okay, I confess, but I did because he was such a jerk. But the thing is, it was that feeling of shame. Now, it's a quaint story. It's a quaint story. It's not a playground where kids are, carrying guns. This didn't take place in an economically strapped or difficult neighborhood. There was no military regime that I was living under. And I wasn't, growing up in a place where there's war being fought every day. I mean, this is a very nice upper middle class, area. I haven't lost loved ones to murder or to gunfire or to assault. I didn't grow up in a home that was domestically violent. It could be rambunctious, but it wasn't domestically, violent or any of those things. And so it's a small story, my story, but the reason I share it is it gave me an inkling of what it feels like on the other side of that. There wasn't this, cheering victory, this triumph. I wasn't being lifted up onto the shoulders of other children on the fifth grade playground and celebrated, or anything like that. It was this incredible shame and this incredible these tears. My memory of it is just, after the being filled with that Mars, was the incredible tears that came out, and it taught me a very deep lesson. What it taught me was to find a better way. You have to find a better way. And in moments like that, and again, I've never been accosted or assaulted or put in a situation where I'm fighting for my life in sheer circumstances, or in areas of life where that's done every day. I've been very, very fortunate, but I did get a glimpse of that. I did get a feeling of that, and it makes me think of people who, are coming back from war. They're not coming back triumphant and celebrated. They're coming back, carrying this trauma, this trauma that they have to live with or deal with or manage for the rest of their lives. So when opened up like that, war is just a horrible thing. Violence is a horrible thing. And so the challenge becomes to do better than that. But how do you do better than that when areas of your life have been taken over? How do you do better than that when your back is really up against the wall? These are very tough questions. Now, we're not all going to be plunged into some sort of, war-torn landscape because of the Mars-Uranus square this week, but you are going to feel, many of you will feel oppressed, pressed upon, challenged, on the other side of an argument where people are just yelling at you, where you've been reduced to a statistic, or you've been reduced to, a catchphrase, and you may feel challenged, you may feel attacked in some way, you may feel like I'm engaged in a good fight. Wherever those good fights show up in your life, take a moment and ask yourself, is this the best way? Nobody's saying not to fight for what's right. Nobody's saying not to defend your rights or as a person, or who you are as a person. But one should ask, is there a better way? Is there a better way to do this? And that's again invoking the higher level of the Mars in Aquarius. Mars in Aquarius can be very ideological, I'm in this camp, you're in that camp, type of thing. But there can also be, a fighting for a higher principle. But we have to remember those higher principles still have feet of clay. And the reason why higher principles have feet of clay is because we're the feet. A higher principle, can be an eternal truth living in the universe, but it doesn't mean anything without a human voice that speaks it, or a human life that's committed to it, or a human being that embodies it. Okay, those principles are nothing if they aren't exercised or visited in ourselves as people. I think something to think about, because there are things where you are challenged, where you have to fight for something, and you have to fight. You have to answer the challenge. There's no question of that. And oftentimes that will show up in a square. Okay, so I have to honor the planetary energy by telling you that. For those of you who are dealing with these challenges and these fights, it's going to become even more so this week during the energy of this square. And so you ask yourself, is there a better way to fight? Is there a better way to meet the challenge? How can I meet the challenge? How do I join a fight that seems dead on finding me wherever I go? It's just like following me wherever I go. How do I rise to this occasion? How do I face this? And the last thing that I wanted to share with you was this interview that I was watching on PBS NewsHour the other night. I love the PBS NewsHour. It's all about Judy. So I was watching the PBS NewsHour the other night, and they were interviewing this priest in the Ukraine. And he's a short sort of fellow, you know. I mean, a little taller than a hobbit, but kind of reminiscent of one, you know, and clearly someone who could be easily, thrown to one side or shot or trampled or whatever. But he has consistently for years put himself into or answered the call. He has consistently for years answered the call to come to the spiritual rescue of soldiers who have been involved, you know, whether they are on the Eastern Front in Ukraine, and right now he's doing this for his what he calls his people, his brothers and sisters who are fighting, and he comes and you know, well, what is he? Is he a priest who's packing heat? Is he picking up a gun? Is he, you know, whatever? And no, he's not. He's walking with the people who are picking up arms. He's walking with the people who are fighting for their country. And he is with them in their hour of need. And oftentimes, recently, that hour of need has been the hour of their passing, where they pass from this world to the next. And so the interviewer was asking him, you know, you're a priest, I mean, a person of peace. What are you doing out here? And he's like, I'm answering the call of my fellow countrymen and women. And they said, well, what do you do? And he says, what I don't make promises. I don't, you know, tell them, you know, things are going to be all right or whatever. What I do is that I see myself as the guardian of their humanity. I see myself as the person who reminds them of their humanity, where they can come to cry, where they can come to confess, where they can come to get angry. He marries soldiers, you know, on the battlefield. He's there for them when they go off to battle, and he's there for when the bodies return and need to be buried at a funeral. And I think that is extraordinarily heroic. You know, it's an answering of the Mars energy, because he has to, you know, he can't flee, he can't evade, he can't, you know, he has to answer that Mars energy, but he's answering that Mars energy with humanity, you know, being that sanctuary of humanity for people who need it at a time when everything looks and must feel so intolerably inhumane. And I think that that's the thing we call upon in the different struggles and the different skirmishes, no matter how great or no matter how small that we face in our lives. You know, everyone's good will face an evil. Everyone's right will face somebody else's wrong. It's a flip of the coin. It's been going on since the beginning of our civilization, as battle lines are drawn and redrawn in different configurations. But the thing that's here for all of us, the thing that's here for each of us who is born into this world, is our humanity. You know, it's the thing that we're fighting to hold on to. It's the thing we're fighting to preserve, and it's the thing that will transcend ideologies. It will transcend politics. It will transcend different cultures and different borders and different battle lines. It's our humanity. And that's the thing that I would ask you to call upon when you face the question of, you know, when is a good fight good? And when is a good fight right? And it's that when you are fighting for the preservation of your humanity and the humanity of your fellow person here on the planet.